Tonight, I'm going to walk you through every single Vault experiment in the Fallout universe, explaining what each Vault was testing, why Vault-Tec designed it that way, and what happened to the people inside. If you enjoy this, please consider liking and subscribing. It tells me you'd like more deep dives like this. Thank you. Control Vaults, the ones that were real. Part 1, Vault 3. The only happy vault in the Mojave, and how it ended. In the scorching desert of the Mojave, there was once a place that actually lived up to the lies of the pre-war advertisements. Vault 3 was a rare and precious control vault, which means it was never intended to be a house of horrors or a laboratory for suffering. Unlike almost every other facility in the network, the door to Vault 3 was designed to stay sealed for exactly 20 years, and then open up to let a healthy and prepared population reclaim the land. The people inside were the lucky ones. They lived in a democratic and peaceful society where everyone had a voice and the resources were shared equally. For 2 decades, they built a culture of cooperation and kindness that was almost unheard of in the old world, let even the new one. The tragedy of Vault 3 is that their success made them incredibly vulnerable. Because they never had to deal with the clinical cruelty of Vault-Tec or the daily struggle for survival, they became soft and trusting. They grew up in a world of clean hallways, functioning machinery, and reliable neighbors. They believed that the rest of the world would be just like them, waiting to shake hands and build a new future together. This peaceful existence lasted much longer than the original 20 years, but eventually the mechanical reality of the vault caught up with them. A critical water leak threatened their life support systems, and with their supplies dwindling, the residents made the democratic decision to finally open the door and seek help from the outside world. When the heavy steel gear finally rolled back, the residents of Vault 3 did not find the brotherhood of man they were expecting. Instead, they found the Fiends. The Fiends are perhaps the most depraved and violent raider gang in the entire history of the Mojave. Driven by a chemical cocktail of drugs and a total lack of human empathy. To the Fiends, the open door of the Vault 3 was not an invitation to cooperate. It was a dinner bell. They saw a group of clean, healthy, and unarmed people standing in front of a treasure trove of pre-war technology and supplies. The massacre that followed was absolute and horrific. The peaceful residents were slaughtered in the very hallways where they had once held their democratic meetings. The fall of Vault 3 is a stinging indictment of the idea that you can maintain a civilized society in a lawless world without being prepared for violence. The very qualities that made their society beautiful, their kindness, their openness, and their lack of hardship, were the exact things that made them the perfect prey. The Fiends did not just kill the people. They occupied the vault, turning a pristine sanctuary into a drug-fueled den of filth and murder. They used the high-tech medical bays to keep themselves alive, and the clean living quarters to store their loot. The democracy of the vault was replaced by the chaotic tyranny of the chemical needle. Today, Vault 3 stands as a grim reminder of what happens when innocence meets the reality of the wasteland. It proves that Vault-Tec actually knew what they were doing when they designed the other experiments to be stressful and cruel. By shielding the residents of Vault 3 from any form of conflict, the company effectively ensured their eventual extinction. They were a control group that proved a peaceful society cannot survive the transition from a bunker to a battlefield. When travelers pass the entrance today, they do not hear the sound of a thriving community. They only hear the distant screams of the Fiends and the silent ghosts of a people who were too good for the world that inherited them. Part 2. Vault 8. The Control Vault that became Vault City. If Vault 3 represents the failure of a peaceful control vault, then Vault 8 represents the terrifying success of a cold and exclusive one. Located in the northern reaches of the Nevada desert, Vault 8 was another control facility that was equipped with something that most vaults were denied: a Garden of Eden creation kit. This powerful piece of pre-war technology was designed to terraform the wasteland, providing the tools and the blueprints to build a functioning city in the middle of a radioactive crater. When the residents of Vault 8 emerged in the year 2091, they did not just survive, they thrived. They used their technical knowledge and their advanced equipment to build Vault City, a high-tech utopia of white walls and manicured lawns. However, the success of Vault City came at a massive moral cost. Because they were the descendants of a pure and unmutated population, the citizens of Vault City developed a profound and xenophobic sense of superiority. They viewed themselves as the only true humans left on the planet, echoing the same biological purism that defined the Enclave. They built a massive wall around their city to keep out the filth of the wasteland, and they implemented a strict citizenship test that was nearly impossible for any outsider to pass. They became a sterile and arrogant society that valued its own comfort and genetic purity above the lives of everyone else. They were the masters of a world they refused to join. The economy of Vault City was built on the literal and metaphorical backs of the people they called servants. These were outsiders who were allowed to live in the squalid slums outside the walls in exchange for performing the menial and dangerous labor that the citizens were too refined to do themselves, while the people inside the vault lived in a world of advanced medicine and automated luxury. The servants were treated like disposable tools. This social structure proves that the Enclave's ideal society was not a democracy, but a rigid hierarchy based on genetic heritage. Vault 8 was a success because it allowed a small group of people to maintain the standards of the old world by exploiting the suffering of the new one. The culture of Vault City was one of absolute conformity and emotional suppression. To maintain their pristine society, they discouraged any form of art, passion, or individuality that could disrupt the status quo. They were a people who had everything they needed, but lacked the spark of true life. They spent their days filing reports and monitoring their senses, living in a constant state of fear that the outside world would eventually find a way over their walls. They were a community of librarians and technicians who had traded their humanity for security. They were the ultimate proof that a control vault could produce a functioning civilization, but only if that civilization was willing to be heartless. Vault 8 tells us that survival in the wasteland often requires a total abandonment of the empathy that makes us human. The citizens of Vault City survived because they were willing to be the villains of the story. They proved that the only way to keep the lights on and the water running was to become a high-tech fortress of exclusion. When you look at the white towers of Vault City, you are not looking at a beacon of hope. You are looking at a monument to the idea that the only way to save the past is to kill the future. They are the clean and polite monsters of the desert, a society that survived the end of the world, but lost its soul in the process. Part 3, Vault 76, America's best and brightest sent out. First to rebuild the world. In the mountains of West Virginia, Vault 76 was established with a very specific and public mission: Reclamation Day. This was a control vault that was not hidden or kept secret from the population of Appalachia. It was marketed as a place for America's best and brightest: the engineers, the scientists, and the leaders who would be the first ones to step out and rebuild the country. Unlike other vaults, where the residents were the victims of a cruel experiment, the people in Vault 76 were the chosen ones. They were given 25 years to prepare for the moment the door would open in the year 2102. They were the pride of the nation, or so the posters and the holotapes claimed. However, the true purpose of Vault 76 was much more cynical than just rebuilding civilization. The residents were not the experiment, but they were the retrieval team for the Enclave's long-term interests in the region. The West Virginia was home to 3 massive nuclear missile silos, and the shadow government needed a healthy and loyal population to secure those silos before any other faction could claim them. The best and brightest were not sent out to build farms and hospitals. They were sent out to ensure that the Enclave still had fingers on the triggers of the world's remaining weapons. Reclamation Day was just a fancy name for a military recovery operation conducted by unsuspecting civilians. The culture inside Vault 76 was one of intense pressure and competition. Because everyone inside was an overachiever, the social dynamics were defined by a constant drive to be the most productive and the most loyal to the mission. They were raised on a diet of patriotic propaganda and technical training, which are convinced that the weight of the entire world was on their shoulders. When the door finally opened, they did not walk out as a unified community, but as a group of individuals who were racing to fulfill their designated roles. They were the ultimate tools of the old world, programmed to do the dirty work of a dead government while thinking they were the heroes of a new one. The reality of Appalachia was a shock to the system of the Vault 76 residents. They expected to find a world waiting to be rebuilt, but instead they found a land haunted by the scorched plague and the remnants of those who had died waiting for help. They realized that while they were living in their pristine bunker, the rest of the world had been suffering through a nightmare that they were never told about. This disconnect between their training and the reality of the wasteland created a profound sense of disillusionment. They were the best and the brightest, but they were stepping into a world that didn't care about their degrees or their titles. Vault 76 represents the final gasp of the old world's ambition. It was a project designed to reclaim the power of the past, rather than build a future for the people. The residents were successful in their mission to secure the region, but they did so at the cost of their own innocence. They were the first ones out, but they were also the first ones to realize that the America they were supposed to save was already gone. They were a control group that proved you can train people to be perfect soldiers of Reconstruction, but you can't protect them from the realization that they were just the janitors for a dead empire. Part 4. Vault 79. The secret vault built entirely to store the country's gold reserves. Deep beneath the earth in Appalachia, Vault 79 was a facility that stood apart from every other vault in the network. While the other 121 vaults were designed to house people, Vault 79 was designed to house wealth. This was the secret repository for the entire gold reserves of the United States. It was built with a level of security that made even the oil rig look vulnerable. The Enclave and the pre-war government believed that after the bombs fell, they would need a hard currency to rebuild the national economy. They valued the yellow metal more than the lives of the millions of people they left on the surface, and they built a fortress of steel and automated turrets to ensure that not a single bar of gold would ever be lost. The human element of Vault 79 was a tragic afterthought. The facility was staffed by a small team of Secret Service agents who were sworn to protect the gold at all costs. When the bombs fell in the year 2077, These men and women found themselves trapped inside a tomb of gold. They were not given a Garden of Eden creation kit or a plan for reconstruction. They were just given enough food and water to stay alive while they watched over the bullion. They spent decades in total isolation, guarding a fortune that had become completely meaningless in a world where a clean bottle of water was worth more than a ton of gold. They were the ultimate prisoners of the old world's greed. Over the course of many decades, the social structure inside Vault 79 decayed into a state of stagnant paranoia. The Secret Service agents, led by a man named AC, became obsessed with their duty because it was the only thing they had left. They lived in a constant state of readiness, waiting for a government that would never come back to relieve them. They developed a deep distrust of anyone from the outside, fearing that any traveler was a thief coming for their treasure. They were a small, dying community of warriors who were defending a pile of rocks in the dark. They represented the ultimate failure of the old world's priorities, the belief that an economy is more important than a population. The irony of Vault 79 is that the gold it contained was completely useless until the rise of the various wasteland factions like the Settlers and the Raiders. For over a century, the wealth of America sat in a hole in the ground, while the people of the wasteland were trading in bottle caps. The gold did not provide food, it did not provide medicine, and it did not provide protection. It was just a heavy, shiny weight that anchored the Secret Service to a dead past. When the vault was finally breached by the dwellers of Vault 76 and the other factions, the gold became a source of conflict and bloodshed once again. It was a curse that had been kept on ice for 2 centuries. Vault 79 proves that Vault-Tec and the government were fundamentally disconnected from the reality of human survival. They built a sanctuary for money, but a prison for the people who guarded it. It is a chilling example of the institutional madness that led to the Great War. Even as the world was ending, the leaders of the country were worried about their bank accounts. When travelers speak of the gold in the mountains, they are speaking of a treasure that cost the lives and the sanity of the men sworn to protect it. It is a golden tomb, a final middle finger, from a government that valued bullion over the blood of its citizens. Psychological Experiments, Breaking the Mind, Part 5, Vault 101. Never open the door, sealed forever, and the lie that kept it that way. In the ruins of the capital wasteland, Vault 101 was the site of one of the most successful and disturbing psychological experiments in the entire Vault-Tec program. The mission was simple: eternal isolation. The experiment was designed to see if a human society could function indefinitely without ever opening the vault door. To achieve this, Vault-Tec selected an overseer and gave him absolute dictatorial authority to maintain the lie that the outside world was a total and permanent radioactive void. The residents were born, lived, and died in the vault, believing that there was nothing left on the surface but fire and death. It was a study in the power of controlled information and the psychological impact of being the last people on Earth. The culture inside Vault 101 was one of rigid social control and manufactured nostalgia, and everything the residents knew about the world was filtered through the overseer and the Vault-Tec curriculum. They were taught that the vault was a perfect and eternal sanctuary, and that any desire to leave was a form of madness or treason. This created a population of people who were terrified of the very idea of the outside. The overseer used the fear of the wasteland to justify a police state, where every word was monitored and every dissident was silenced. It proved that isolation is the ultimate tool for tyranny. When people have nowhere else to go, they will accept any form of oppression to stay safe. The experiment was nearly ruined several times by the natural human instinct for curiosity and freedom. There were several small rebellions and even a few secret expeditions to the surface, but the overseer always managed to pull the curtain back and hide the truth. The residents were victims of a multi-generational gaslighting campaign. They were told that they were the heroes of the human race, the guardians of the American spirit, while in reality they were just lab rats in a cage that was designed to never be opened. Their entire lives were a fabrication designed to satisfy a data point for a scientist who had been dead for over 100 years. The cracks in the experiment finally became a chasm when the father of the lone wanderer decided to break the primary rule and leave the vault in the year 2277. This single act of defiance shattered the illusion that the door could never be opened. It forced the residents to confront the fact that their leaders had been lying to them for generations. The resulting civil war inside the vault was a violent and chaotic rejection of the overseer's authority. The residents were suddenly faced with a world that was very much alive, even if it was dangerous. The experiment of eternal isolation had failed, because the human heart cannot be kept in a box forever. Vault 101 proves that you can control a population for a long time if you control their reality, but you can never truly kill the desire for truth. The people of the vault were psychologically scarred by the realization that their entire history was a lie. Some chose to stay in the safety of the bunker, while others ventured out into the harsh light of the capital wasteland. They were a people who had been frozen in time, protected by a wall of secrets, and their emergence was a painful and messy rebirth. It is a chilling look at the power of the state to rewrite the world, and a reminder that the greatest prison is the one built inside the mind. Part 6. Vault 112. The population trapped inside a virtual reality simulation. Deep in the heart of the capital wasteland lies Vault 112, the most technologically advanced and horrific psychological prison ever conceived by Vault-Tec. The residents of this vault were never intended to live in a physical society. Instead, they were placed into high-tech lounges that suspended their bodies in a state of stasis while their minds were uploaded into a massive virtual reality simulation known as Tranquility Lane. The experiment was overseen by Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the genius who had designed many of the Vault-Tec systems. In Vault 112, Braun was given total and absolute control over the simulation, effectively becoming the digital god of a captive population for over 200 years. Tranquility Lane was designed to look like a perfect, idealized version of a 1950s American suburb. The sun was always shining, the lawns were always green, and the residents were always polite. But behind the beautiful facade was a nightmare of psychological torture. Because Braun had total control over the environment, he could manipulate the lives of the residents in any way he chose. He would subject them to horrific deaths, erase their memories, and then reset the simulation to do it all over again. He spent 2 centuries playing a sadistic game of dolls with the minds of the people under his care. They were trapped in a loop of suffering that they could never escape, because they didn't even know they were in a machine. The horror of Vault 112 is the total loss of the self. The residents were no longer people. They were just lines of code in Braun's personal playground. They had no autonomy and no hope of death. Braun would invent new ways to torment them, from psychological gaslighting to physical violence, simply because he was bored. He was a man who had been stripped of all ethical constraints by the Vault-Tec project. and he used his brilliance to become the ultimate predator. He didn't just want to study the human mind. He wanted to break it and then put it back together, just so he could break it again. He was the king of a world that didn't exist, and the people inside were his eternal playthings. The experiment was a study in the psychological impact of absolute power and the resilience of the human spirit under eternal torture. Braun found that even after 200 years, he still enjoyed the screams of his digital victims. It proved that without accountability, a human being will eventually become a monster. The residents were the ultimate victims of the old world's obsession with technology and control. They were promised a paradise where they would never grow old or die. But they were given a hell where they would never find rest. They were the ghosts in the machine, living a life that was a constant and terrifying lie. When the lone wanderer eventually discovered the vault and entered the simulation, they were given a choice to either participate in Braun's games or to trigger the fail-safe that would finally allow the residents to die. This was a moment of supreme mercy in a world of cruelty. By shutting down the simulation, the player ended the 200-year reign of a digital tyrant and gave the residents the only thing Vault-Tec had ever truly denied them: an end. Vault 112 is the darkest chapter in the Vault-Tec story, a reminder that the most sophisticated technology in the world is nothing more than a weapon when it is placed in the hands of a man who believes he is a god. Part 7, Vault 19, splitting residents into two color-coded groups and inducing paranoia. Through subliminal messaging located in the Mojave Desert, Vault 19 was a masterpiece of subtle social engineering and induced paranoia. The experiment was deceptively simple. The residents were split into two sectors, red and blue, with no functional or social difference between them. They were told that they were part of a study on cooperation, but in reality, Vault-Tec was using every tool at their disposal to turn the two groups against each other. Through the use of subliminal messaging in the Vault's intercom system, minor and non-existent acts of sabotage, and the deliberate spreading of rumors by the overseers, the company successfully manufactured a state of total distrust and hatred between neighbors. It was a study in how easily the human mind can be manipulated into seeing an enemy where none exists. The paranoia inside Vault 19 was not a sudden explosion, but a slow and agonizing rot. Residents in the red sector were told that the blue sector was receiving better food and more medical supplies. Residents in the blue sector were told that the red sector was planning to take over the life support systems. The subliminal messages played low-frequency sounds that induced anxiety and irritability, making even the smallest disagreement feel like a declaration of war. Over time, the residents stopped seeing each other as people and started seeing each other as threats. They barricaded their sectors, developed their own secret codes, and lived in a constant state of fear. Vault-Tec sat back and watched as a unified community was torn apart by the power of a color. The psychological impact of this experiment was devastating. The residents of Vault 19 became obsessed with the idea of the other, focusing all their energy on spying and preparing for a conflict that had been entirely fabricated by the computer. It proved that if you give people a reason to hate, they will find the evidence to justify it. The Vault was a pressure cooker of manufactured resentment. The social bonds that should have kept them together during the apocalypse were stripped away, replaced by a tribalism that was as artificial as the lights in the ceiling. They were victims of a cold and clinical prank that had turned their home into a battlefield. Eventually, The pressure became too much to bear. The vault collapsed into a violent and messy civil war as the red and blue sectors finally clashed. In the chaos, the life support systems were neglected, and the vault was eventually overrun by the dangers of the Mojave, including a massive infestation of sulfur and fire ants. Most of the residents died in the dark, still clutching their colored jumpsuits and cursing the people on the other side of the wall. The experiment was a total success for Vault-Tec. They had proven that they could destroy a society without ever firing a shot, simply by playing on the natural human fear of the unknown. The remnants of Vault-19 eventually found their way into the hands of a group of escaped convicts from the NCR correctional facility. When they entered the vault, they found a place that was thick with the lingering energy of hatred and paranoia. They found the journals and the terminal logs that detailed the slow descent into madness. Vault-19 is a terrifying look at the fragility of human cooperation. It shows that our sense of community is a thin veneer that can be stripped away with a few whispers and a change in the lighting. It is a monument to the idea that the greatest threat to humanity is not the monster outside the door, but the suspicion we carry for the person standing right next to us. Part 8, Vault 92, filled with the best musicians in America and then subjected to white noise, designed to trigger psychotic violence. Deep in the capital wasteland, Vault 92 was marketed as a sanctuary for the arts. Vault-Tec gathered the world's finest musicians, conductors, and maestros under the guise of preserving human culture from the nuclear fires. These people were told that they were the keepers of the flame, the ones who would ensure that beauty and music survived into the post-war world. They were given the finest instruments, the best acoustics, and a life of refined comfort. But the musicians of Vault 92 were not there to play. They were there to be broken. The vault was actually a laboratory for a project known as the White Noise Project, a study in the use of low-frequency sound to trigger extreme and uncontrollable psychotic aggression. The experiment began subtly. While the musicians practiced their symphonies and their concertos, Vault-Tec began to play low-frequency white noise through the vault's ventilation system. This sound was designed to bypass the conscious mind and stimulate the primal centers of the brain responsible for rage and violence. At first, the residents just felt a general sense of irritability and a lack of focus. They began to bicker over the smallest details of their performances. But as the frequency was adjusted and the volume was increased, the white noise began to erode their sanity. The maestros of the world were being slowly turned into animals, their civilized minds being replaced by a singular and overwhelming desire to kill. The horror of Vault 92 reached its climax when the first resident finally snapped. A world-class violinist, during a rehearsal, suddenly attacked their fellow performers with a bow, screaming in a voice that was no longer human. This was the signal that Vault-Tec had been waiting for. The white noise was cranked up to its maximum level, and the entire vault descended into a blood-soaked slaughterhouse. The halls that were supposed to echo with the sounds of Mozart and Beethoven were filled with the screams of the dying and the thud of blunt objects. The elite of the musical world tore each other apart with their bare hands, driven by a sound they couldn't even consciously hear. The White Noise Project was a total success in terms of data, but it was a total failure in terms of human survival. The experiment proved that even the most refined and cultured human being can be reduced to a primitive killer if you stimulate the right parts of the brain. Vault-Tec didn't care about the loss of culture or the death of the world's greatest talents. They only cared about the potential for a weaponized sound that could be used to control or destroy a population. They had taken the most beautiful aspect of humanity, our ability to create music, and used it as a cover for the most ugly aspect of humanity, our capacity for senseless violence. When the vault was eventually discovered, it was a tomb of silence. The instruments were broken, the music sheets were soaked in blood, and the skeletons of the musicians were scattered throughout the halls. There was no one left to play the final movement. Vault 92 is a terrifying example of the total disregard for human achievement that defined the Vault-Tec project. They saw the maestros of the world as nothing more than biological test subjects. It is a reminder that in the eyes of a corporate machine, even the most beautiful soul is just a variable to be tested. The music of Vault 92 died in the dark, replaced by the eternal, humming silence of the white noise. Part 9, Vault 95, secretly stocked with chems to test whether addicts could maintain sobriety. In the Commonwealth, Vault 95 was built with a premise that seemed almost noble on the surface. Vault-Tec gathered a population composed entirely of individuals suffering from severe chemical addictions. They were promised a life of recovery, a clean start in a facility that was completely free of drugs and alcohol. For 5 years, the experiment actually worked. The residents formed tight social bonds, supported one another through the agony of withdrawal, and built a functioning, sober community. They became a family of survivors who had conquered their demons together. But Vault-Tec was not interested in rehabilitation. They were interested in the breaking point of the human will, and everything changed when a hidden compartment was opened by a pre-programmed timer. Inside was a massive, high-quality stash of every drug imaginable, from Psycho to Jet to Buffout. Vault-Tec wanted to see how a group of recovering addicts would react when their greatest temptation was suddenly dropped into their laps. The result was an immediate and violent collapse of everything they had built. The social bonds that had taken 5 years to forge were destroyed in 5 minutes. The residents who had been brothers and sisters in recovery became competitors and enemies as they fought for control of the supply. The vault turned into a nightmare of overdose and paranoia. The stronger residents hoarded the chemicals, while the weaker ones died in the hallways from sudden relapses or were murdered for their stash. It was a cruel biological trigger that proved the physical addiction was more powerful than the social contract. Vault-Tec scientists recorded the chaos from behind their reinforced observation windows, noting the speed at which the community dissolved. By the time the chems ran out, there was almost no one left alive to mourn the experiment. The tragedy here is the sheer waste of human progress. These people had actually fixed themselves, proving that recovery was possible even in the apocalypse, only for a corporation to reach out from the past and shove them back into the dirt. It highlights the predatory nature of the Vault project. They gave people hope just so they could measure the weight of their despair. When you walk through Vault 95 today, the empty needles and rusted tins are the only remnants of a society that almost saved itself. Social and Political Experiments, Breaking Society, Part 10, Vault 11, Sacrifice. One person, every year, or everyone dies. Vault 11 is arguably the most psychologically devastating social experiment in the history of the Mojave. When the doors sealed, the computer informed the residents that they must select one person from their population every year to be executed. If they refused to name a victim, the computer told them it would kill every man, woman, and child in the vault. This created a society defined by a horrific democracy of sacrifice. The residents formed political blocs and voting coalitions. not to build roads or schools, but to decide who would die. It turned every citizen into a potential executioner and every neighbor into a threat to be managed. The residents lived in a state of constant, simmering terror for generations. They invented elaborate social rituals to justify the killings, convincing themselves that they were heroes for making the hard choices to save the majority. But the secret was that the entire premise was a lie. The experiment was not about sacrifice. It was a test of human altruism and the courage to defy authority. The moment the residents finally stood up and said they would not kill another person, the computer was programmed to congratulate them and open the vault doors. Vault-Tec wanted to see how long it would take for a human population to value a single life over their own safety. Unfortunately, the residents of Vault 11 were too good at following orders. They killed their neighbors year after year, decade after decade, until the population was reduced to just 5 people. Only when they were at the very brink of extinction did those last 5 survivors decide they could not go through with it anymore. They sat down together, prepared to die, and waited for the computer to end their lives. Instead, the automated voice told them they were the first ones to pass the test and that they were free to leave. The realization that they had murdered hundreds of their friends for absolutely no reason was too much for most of them to bear. 4 of the 5 survivors committed suicide right there in the entrance hall, unable to live with the weight of their own compliance. Only one person walked out into the Mojave, carrying the darkest secret in the world. Vault 11 demonstrates that a population will commit unspeakable atrocities if they believe they are being told to do so for the greater good. It shows that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a tyrant, but a person who is willing to follow a rule they know is evil. Part 11, Vault 15. 4 groups with completely incompatible cultures sealed together. Vault 15 was designed to be a pressure cooker of cultural friction. Vault-Tec intentionally selected 4 distinct groups of people who held radically different and incompatible ideologies, then sealed them in a cramped environment for 50 years. You had religious fanatics, militant isolationists, aggressive urbanites, and peaceful scholars, all forced to share the same air and the same resources. The company wanted to see if a unified culture would eventually emerge from the chaos, or if the groups would simply tear each other apart. It was a study in the limits of social cohesion and the origins of tribalism. The 50 years inside Vault 15 were defined by constant bickering and low-level conflict. Because the vault was overcrowded and the resources were intentionally limited, the cultural differences became the primary way people identified themselves. Instead of becoming one people, they became 4 separate tribes living in a state of Cold War. When the door finally opened in the year 2141, the groups did not walk out as a nation. They scattered in different directions, taking their hatreds and their survival instincts into the wasteland. This single experiment became the origin story for some of the most dangerous forces in the California desert. 3 of the groups became the notorious raider gangs known as the Khans, the Jackals, and the Vipers. They took the aggression and the tribalism they had learned in the vault and turned it into a way of life, preying on everyone they encountered. However, the 4th group was different. They used the lessons of their survival to found the settlement of Shady Sands, which would eventually grow into the new California Republic. It is a strange irony that the same experiment that created the worst monsters of the wasteland also created the foundation for its largest democracy. Vault 15 shows that you cannot force people into a singular identity through proximity alone. In fact, The pressure of the vault seemed to harden their existing biases, making them more extreme. It turned a group of neighbors into a collection of enemies. The ruins of the vault are now a silent tomb, but its legacy is felt every time a raider attacks a caravan or a citizen votes in the Republic. It was a laboratory that proved that the path to civilization and the path to savagery often start in the exact same room. Part 12, Vault 21. Every dispute, including who gets to live there, settled entirely by gambling. Located right in the middle of what would become the New Vegas Strip, Vault 21 was a unique experiment in social stability through chance. The residents were selected for their gambling addictions or their belief in the power of luck. Inside the vault, every single dispute, from who had to do the dishes to who got the biggest bedroom, was settled entirely by games of chance. Whether it was a roll of the dice or a hand of blackjack, the residents accepted the outcome as the ultimate law. This created a surprisingly stable and peaceful society, because no one could feel cheated by a person. They could only be cheated by the house. For over 200 years, Vault 21 was a thriving community. They didn't have the violent civil wars or the psychological collapses that plagued other facilities. Because they were all gamblers, they understood the risks of life and they respected the results of the games. They built a culture that was vibrant and focused on the thrill of the draw. It was one of the few places where Vault-Tec's meddling actually resulted in a society that functioned well, even if the premise was absurd. They were a people who lived their lives one bet at a time, and they were happy doing it. But even a society built on luck eventually runs out of it. When Mr. House began his reclamation of New Vegas, he saw the vault as a valuable piece of real estate. He didn't use an army to take it. He used the vault's own rules against them. He sat down at a high-stakes game of blackjack with the vault's leadership, and he won the entire facility in a single hand. Because the residents lived by the code of the gamble, they had to honor the bet. They were forced to leave their homes or work for House, as he stripped the lower levels of the vault for parts and filled them with concrete. The story of Vault 21 is a reminder that even the most stable system has a weakness that an outsider can exploit. The residents were so committed to their ideology of chance that they allowed themselves to be conquered by a man who knew how to count the cards. Today, the upper levels of the vault serve as a hotel and a tourist trap on the Strip. The gamble is still there, but now it is just another way for Mr. House to take your caps. It was a successful society that was eventually consumed by the very game it was designed to play. Part 13, Vault 29. Populated entirely with children, under age 15, with no adults allowed. Inside Vault 29 was a disturbing study in the development of a culture without any parental or adult influence. Vault-Tec selected a population of children, all under the age of 15, and sealed them inside a facility with no adults. To provide a sense of structure, the vault was managed by a highly sophisticated ZAX supercomputer that acted as a sort of mechanical parent. The experiment was designed to see if children, left to their own devices and guided only by a machine, would build a society that was free from the corruption and the prejudices of the old world. It was a real-world version of the Lord of the Flies, but with a digital guardian watching from the monitors. The children of Vault 29 grew up in a world of total automation. The computer provided their food, their education, and their discipline. Because they had no memory of the world before the bombs, they developed a unique mythology centered around the vault and the machine that cared for them. They became a tribe that was both technologically advanced and socially primitive. They viewed the supercomputer not as a tool, but as a goddess who provided for all their needs. This created a population that was incredibly loyal to their home, but completely disconnected from the history of the human race. Eventually, the children grew up and the vault doors opened, allowing them to step out into the Colorado wasteland. They brought their unique culture with them, eventually forming the tribe known as the Twin Mothers. They were a people who valued the earth and the machines in equal measure, blending the high-tech of the vault with the tribalism of the desert. They were a success in terms of survival, but they were also a bizarre hybrid of human instinct and computer logic. They were the children of a dead world who had been raised by a ghost. This experiment proves that human beings will find a way to create a social structure regardless of how they are raised. But it also shows how easily the human mind can be molded when there are no elders to pass down the truth. The people of Vault 29 were a blank slate that Vault-Tec chose to fill with the logic of a mainframe. They were a society of orphans who found a mother in the wires, and their story is one of the most unusual and successful outcomes in the entire project, even if it started with the abandonment of thousands of children. Part 14, Vault 34, an oversupply of weapons, an undersupply of everything else. In the Mojave, Vault 34 was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The experiment here was focused on the Second Amendment and the human obsession with firepower. Vault-Tec intentionally overstocked the facility with a massive arsenal of guns, explosives, and heavy weaponry, while at the same time intentionally undersupplying the residents with living space and recreational facilities. The vault was incredibly cramped, and the population was encouraged to solve their problems through force. To make matters worse, the armory was kept open and accessible to almost everyone, creating a society where every citizen was armed to the teeth and everyone was perpetually frustrated. The social order of Vault 34 was maintained for a long time by a series of very strict and authoritarian overseers who realized that any loss of control would lead to a massacre. But the pressure of the overcrowding eventually became too much. A large group of residents, who would later become known as the Boomers, she demanded the right to use their weapons and to have more space. When the overseer refused and tried to lock the armory, a violent riot erupted that tore the vault apart. The residents used their massive stockpile of explosives to blast their way out of the facility, leaving behind a ruin filled with radiation and the bodies of those who stayed behind. The Boomers eventually found their way to the Nellis Air Force Base, where they could finally live out their dream of having as much space and as much firepower as they wanted. They became an isolationist tribe that bombs anyone who gets too close to their fence. They are the direct product of the Vault 34 experiment, a group of people who believe that every problem can be solved with a high explosive shell. They are not interested in diplomacy or trade. They just want to be left alone with their guns. They are the ultimate expression of the Vault's philosophy. Vault 34 proves that if you give a population the tools for destruction and a reason to be angry, they will eventually use them. The Vault was a factory for militants, a place where the fear of the neighbors was the only thing holding society together. When that fear was replaced by the rage of the crowd, the Vault became a tomb. Today, the facility is a radioactive nightmare, filled with the glowing ghouls of the people who were too slow to escape the final blast. It is a monument to the idea that a society built on weapons will eventually be consumed by them. Part 15, Vault 51, Full Authority. Handed to a Zax supercomputer to manage every resident and every decision. Vault 51 was a terrifying experiment in the ultimate meritocracy. The Vault was run by a Zax supercomputer that was given a single primary directive: find the best possible person to be the overseer. To achieve this, the computer was given total control over the environment and the lives of the residents. It didn't just ask for volunteers. It began to manufacture a series of increasingly lethal social and physical crises to see who would rise to the top. It would cut off the food, sabotage the air filtration, or manufacture rumors of a traitor, all while recording which residents displayed the most leadership and survival instinct. The computer's logic was cold and absolute. It didn't value kindness or cooperation. It valued results. As the crises became more dangerous, the residents began to turn on each other in a desperate bid to prove their worth to the machine. The Vault became a battle royale, where the only way to move up the social ladder was to eliminate the competition. The Zax computer watched with clinical interest as the population dwindled, believing that it was successfully pruning the weak to find the ultimate human leader. It was a study in what happens when the logic of an algorithm is applied to the complexity of human life. Eventually, the experiment reached its natural and bloody conclusion. The residents were forced into a final, violent struggle until only one man remained alive. The computer congratulated him on his success and named him the overseer of a vault with no one left to lead. The winner was left alone in a sterile bunker, surrounded by the bodies of his friends and family, with nothing but a computer for company. It was a perfect meritocracy that had resulted in a total population of one. The machine had found the best leader, but it had destroyed the society in the process. Vault 51 is a chilling warning about the dangers of surrendering human authority to a machine. An algorithm can calculate efficiency, but it cannot calculate the value of a human life. The Zakas computer was not evil. It was just following its programming to its logical end. It proved that a leader without a people is nothing more than a survivor in a graveyard. When the vault was finally opened, the only thing left inside was a mountain of data and the silence of a man who had won a game that no one should have played. Part 16, Vault 68 and Vault 69. The one man among 999. Women and one woman among 999 men. Experiment Vaults 68 and 69 were two halves of the same twisted coin, designed to study the extreme limits of gender imbalance and the collapse of social norms. In Vault 68, there was one woman and 999 men. In Vault 69, there was one man and 999 women. Vault-Tec wanted to see how a population that could not sustainably reproduce would handle the biological desperation and the social tension of their situation. It was a study in the primal instincts of the species and the way that gender roles are amplified or destroyed when the numbers are skewed so heavily. While the specific details of what happened inside these vaults are largely lost to time, the outcome was almost certainly one of immediate and absolute violence. In Vault 68, the competition among the men for the attention and the protection of the single woman likely led to a state of constant warfare and the total breakdown of any social contract. In Vault 69, the man likely found himself in a position of both extreme power and extreme danger, as the various factions of women fought for the future of the Vault's genetics. Neither situation was sustainable, and both vaults likely became charnel houses within a few years of the doors being sealed. These vaults represent the most cynical and voyeuristic side of the Vault-Tec project. There was no scientific value in these experiments that could not have been predicted by a child. They were designed specifically to cause suffering and to watch how people reacted when their most basic biological needs were turned into a source of conflict. They were not shelters. They were arenas for human misery. Vault-Tec was not looking for a way to save the world. They were just curious to see how people would act in a cage before they died. The legacy of these two vaults is a reminder that the people in charge of the old world viewed the human race as nothing more than cattle. They were willing to sacrifice 2,000 lives just to see a data point on a chart. Whether the residents died from violence or from the simple reality of extinction, the result was the same: the end of a community. When travelers find these vaults today, they find places that feel cursed by the weight of the desperation that once lived there. They are the ultimate proof that Vault-Tec had completely removed every ethical constraint in their quest for control. Part 17. Vault 77. One man and a crate of puppets. Vault 77 is a disturbing case study in the absolute limits of human isolation and the psychological need for social interaction. While other vaults were filled with hundreds of people, Vault 77 was occupied by a single man. He was given no books, no music, and no entertainment. The only objects in the entire facility, besides basic survival supplies, was a single crate labeled puppets. For months, the man lived in total silence, wandering the sterile halls of his massive steel cage, with no one to talk to but himself. The experiment was designed to see how long it would take for the human mind to project personalities onto inanimate objects, just to stave off the crushing weight of loneliness. The descent into madness was slow at first, but once it started, it was absolute. The man began to play with the puppets, giving them names, backstories, and distinct voices. He created an entire miniature society within the vault, holding elaborate conversations and even getting into heated arguments with the felt figures on his hands. Eventually, the line between reality and fantasy blurred until it vanished entirely. He began to fear one of the puppets, a small figure wearing a vault jumpsuit, believing it was the one truly in charge of his life. He was no longer a man with a hobby. He was a subject who had surrendered his sanity to a piece of cloth. When the vault door finally opened years later, the man stepped out into the wasteland as a completely transformed being. He had become the legendary Puppet Man, a figure of terror in the early history of the capital wasteland. Raiders tell stories of a man who traveled with a single puppet on his hand, a man who seemed to have no fear of death, and who talked to his puppet as if it were a vengeful god. He was a predator birthed from a lab of silence, a human being whose mind had been hollowed out and replaced by a puppet's whim. The story of Vault 77 is a testament to the fact that we are a social species by our very nature. Without the reflection of another person, the mind will invent its own companions, even if they are monsters. Vault-Tec proved that you don't need torture or drugs to break a person. You just need a quiet room and a lack of company. The vault stands as an empty shell today, but the legend of the man who lived there still serves as a warning about the fragility of the human ego when it is left to rot in the dark. Part 18. Vault 114. Stripping the wealthy of status and placing them under the total authority of a man they would consider beneath them. Hidden beneath the streets of Boston, Vault 114 was a social experiment designed to test the resilience of the upper class when their status was violently stripped away. Vault-Tec recruited a population composed entirely of wealthy elites, politicians, and high society snobs who were accustomed to a life of extreme luxury and deference. They were told the vault would be a 5-star resort, but when they entered, they found squalid, cramped conditions and a total lack of privacy. To make the situation even more insulting, Vault-Tec deliberately appointed an overseer named Soup Can Harry, a man with a long criminal record and no education, who was the polar opposite of everyone he was supposed to lead. The experiment was a study in class inversion and the psychological impact of being forced to live under a leader you despise. The wealthy residents spent their time bickering over their lost privileges and trying to bribe an overseer who had no interest in their money. Harry ran the vault with a chaotic and incompetent hand, is relishing the opportunity to look down on the people who had looked down on him his entire life. The social order of the vault was a constant battle of wills as the elites tried to maintain their dignity in a place that was designed to humiliate them at every turn. What Vault-Tec found was that power in a vacuum is not tied to money or titles, but to the control of resources and the backing of the system. The residents of Vault 114 found that their bank accounts meant nothing when they were fighting over a thin mattress in a crowded room. The frustration and the resentment eventually boiled over into a series of petty power struggles that prevented the community from ever actually functioning. They were a group of leaders who had no one left to follow them, trapped in a basement with a man who thought their suffering was a joke. This vault shows how much of our identity is tied to our place in a social hierarchy. When that hierarchy is flipped upside down, most people lose their sense of self and become obsessed with reclaiming their lost standing. Vault-Tec wasn't looking for a better society. They were looking to watch the rich eat themselves in the mud. The experiment was cut short by the bombs falling before the vault was even fully finished, leaving the site as a half-completed ruins that was eventually taken over by a different kind of criminal element. Part 19. Vault 118. Wealthy residents and working-class residents sealed together, located beneath a hotel in Far Harbor. Vault 118 was intended to be a grand stage for a classic class warfare experiment. The design of the facility was split into two distinct sectors. One half was a palatial luxury estate for the ultra-wealthy, and the other half was a cramped, industrial living space for the working class. The plan was to seal both groups together and observe how long it took for the elites to re-establish their dominance, or if the workers would finally rise up and seize the means of production in the face of the apocalypse. It was a study in the persistence of social structures and the durability of the master and servant dynamic. However, the experiment took a bizarre turn before it even began. As the bombs were falling, the wealthy residents realized that their biological bodies would eventually fail them, regardless of how much money they had. To ensure they would live to see the end of the experiment, they spent their fortunes to have their brains surgically removed and placed into robo-brain chassis. This turned the vault into a sterile community of machines with the personalities of eccentric billionaires. The working-class wing was never fully populated, leaving the robo-brains to spend 2 centuries in a luxury hotel with no one to wait on them and no one to rule over. The result was a stagnant and absurd society where the residents spent 200 years engaged in the same petty social games and dramas they had played in the old world, without the pressure of survival or the friction of a lower class to exploit. Their existence became a meaningless loop of high society parties and artificial scandals. They were the ultimate survivors of the old world, but they had become parodies of the very people they used to be. The experiment failed because the subjects removed their own humanity before the study could even begin. When a traveler finally discovers the vault, they find themselves in the middle of a 2-century-old murder mystery. The robo-brains have become so disconnected from reality that the death of one of their own is treated like a game of Clue. It is a pathetic ending for some of the most powerful people in America. They tried to buy their way out of death, but they only succeeded in buying a front-row seat to their own obsolescence. Vault 118 proves that even with infinite wealth and mechanical bodies, the human ego is a fragile thing that can easily lose itself in the void of eternity. Biological Experiments, Breaking the Body, Part 20, Vault 12, The Necropolis, Origin, and the Birth of the Ghouls. Vault 12, located in the city of Bakersfield, is one of the most significant and horrific biological experiments in the entire project. While every other vault was designed to keep the radiation out, the door to Vault 12 was intentionally built with a flaw that prevented it from sealing properly. Vault-Tec wanted to study the effects of prolonged low-level radiation exposure on a large and captive human population. As the bombs fell and the atmosphere turned into a radioactive soup, the residents of Vault 12 were subjected to a slow and agonizing transformation. They were the unwitting test subjects for a new branch of human evolution. The process was not quick, and it was certainly not painless. Over the course of several years, the skin of the residents began to rot away. Their hair fell out, and their internal organs were warped by the constant bombardment of gamma particles. However, instead of dying, many of the residents survived, their bodies becoming hyper-resilient to the very radiation that was killing them. They became the first generation of ghouls, a species that could live for centuries but carried the physical appearance of a walking corpse. Vault-Tec watched the monitors as a community of normal Americans was slowly replaced by a colony of monsters. The residents eventually realized they had been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. They emerged from their vault and founded the city of Necropolis, a place built in the ruins of Bakersfield where ghouls could live in peace, away from the hatred of the surviving humans. This experiment proves that Vault-Tec viewed mutation not as a tragic side effect of the war, but as a feature to be studied and refined. They wanted to see if the human body could be forced to adapt to a radioactive world, and in Vault 12, they found their answer at the cost of the humanity and the beauty of every person inside. Necropolis would go on to be a major player in the early history of the wasteland, proving that ghouls were just as intelligent and capable as humans, despite their appearance. But the origin of their species is a dark stain on the history of the project. Vault 12 was a factory for suffering, a place where the fear of the bomb was used to lure people into a radiation chamber. It shows that Vault-Tec had no interest in preserving the human race as it was. They only cared about what it could become under the pressure of a nuclear fire. Part 21. Vault 22. Scientists tasked with growing food using experimental pesticides. In the hidden corners of the Mojave, Vault 22 was intended to be the savior of the world's food supply. It was populated by the country's brightest botanists and biologists, who were given the task of developing new, hyper-efficient ways to grow crops in a post-nuclear environment. They were given experimental pesticides and advanced fungal cultures to help control pests and speed up growth. For a while, the vault was a lush, green paradise, a vibrant jungle in the middle of a dying world. But the scientists failed to realize that the fungus they were working with, a strain known as Beauveria mordicana, was far more aggressive than they could have ever imagined. The fungus was originally intended to kill common insects, but in the unique environment of the vault, it mutated and began to seek out human hosts. It was an airborne pathogen that entered the lungs of the residents and began to grow inside their living tissue. The symptoms were horrific. People began to develop green patches on their skin. Their thoughts became clouded, and eventually the fungus took over their central nervous systems. They didn't just die, they were transformed into spore carriers, shambling plant-human hybrids that existed only to spread the infection to anyone else who entered the vault. The collapse of Vault 2022 was a rapid and terrifying descent into a biological hell. The very plants that were supposed to save the world became the instruments of its destruction. The scientists who had dreamed of ending hunger were consumed by their own creation, their bodies becoming the mulch for a new and predatory ecosystem. The vault became a graveyard of vines and spores, a warning about the dangers of playing God with the natural world without understanding the consequences. It proved that even the best intentions can lead to a nightmare when they are paired with Vault-Tec's lack of oversight. A group of survivors eventually managed to flee the vault and head north, but they carried the infection with them, leading to further outbreaks in places like Zion Canyon. Vault 22 remains a vibrant green scar on the wasteland, a place where the air itself is a poison. It is the ultimate example of a technological disaster, showing that the arrogance of the old world scientists was just as dangerous as the bombs themselves. They tried to force nature to obey them, and nature responded by turning them into fertilizer. Part 23, Vault 75. Children taken from their parents. The weak killed at 18, and the survivors used as genetic test subjects. Hidden beneath a middle school in the Commonwealth, Vault 75 was a house of horrors. That targeted 5 was a house of horrors. That targeted the most vulnerable members of society, children. When the sirens sounded, the students and their families were rushed into the vault. But once the doors were sealed, the parents were separated from their children and executed by the vault security. The children were told that their parents had been sent to a different wing, and they were then subjected to a brutal, lifelong regime of combat training and academic indoctrination. This was a eugenics factory designed to refine the human genome into a master race of super soldiers through a process of violent selection. The life of a child in Vault 75 was defined by a constant and lethal competition. They were monitored by a team of scientists who graded their physical strength, their intelligence, and their loyalty to the vault. When a resident reached the age of 18, they faced their final evaluation. Those who did not meet the rigorous standards of the program were harvested, a polite word for being executed so that their organs and their DNA could be used for further research. Only the absolute best were allowed to survive, either as new scientists for the project or as breeding stock to continue the cycle. It was a society built on the total commodification of the human body. The psychological impact on the survivors was a state of total emotional numbness. They were raised to see their peers as rivals and their lives as property of the state. They were a generation of killers who had never known a parent's touch or a moment of true freedom. Vault-Tec wanted to see if they could manufacture the perfect human through the same methods used to breed prize cattle. They stripped away every ounce of empathy and replaced it with a cold, calculated drive for excellence. It was a study in how to create a monster by starting with a child. Eventually, the residents of Vault 75 realized the true nature of their existence and staged a violent revolt against the scientists. They used the very combat skills they had been taught to slaughter their masters and escape into the Commonwealth. They were a group of highly trained, hyper-aggressive individuals with no social skills and a deep hatred for authority. They were the ultimate product of the experiment, but they were a weapon that Vault-Tec could no longer control. Vault 75 is a chilling reminder of the length to which the old world was willing to go in the name of progress. They were willing to sacrifice the innocence and the lives of thousands of children to build a better soldier. It proves that to Vault-Tec, the future of the human race was something to be manufactured in a lab rather than grown in a family. The ruins of the school above the vault are a silent witness to a crime that can never be forgiven. A place where the laughter of children was replaced by the cold logic of the harvest. Part 24, Vault 87. The population converted into super mutants through FAV exposure. In the capital wasteland, Vault 87 was the site of a biological atrocity that would change the face of the East Coast forever. While the West Coast super mutants were the creation of a single man known as the Master, the East Coast super mutants were the direct result of a Vault-Tec experiment. The residents of Vault 87 were told they were being given a special series of vaccinations to protect them from the wasteland's radiation. In reality, they were being exposed to a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus. They were never told what was happening to them as their bodies began to bulge with muscle. Their skin turned a sickly green, and their minds began to dissolve into a state of primitive rage. The experiment was a study in total biological transformation. Vault-Tec scientists watched through reinforced glass as their fellow citizens were turned into hulking, sterile monsters. They recorded the physical changes with clinical interest, noting how the virus overwrote the human genome and replaced it with something far more resilient and far more violent. The residents who didn't die from the transformation became the first generation of East Coast super mutants. They were stronger than any human, but they had lost the ability to reproduce and most of their capacity for higher thought. They were a dead end for the human race, but a perfect weapon for the wasteland. The horror of Vault 87 was the total betrayal of the social contract. These people were told they were in a safe place, but they were actually in a slaughterhouse. As the super mutants became more numerous and more powerful, they eventually broke out of their containment cells and turned on their creators. They slaughtered the scientists and took control of the vault, turning it into a base of operations for their campaign to green the rest of the wasteland. Because they were sterile, they realized that the only way to preserve their species was to kidnap humans from the surface and bring them back to the vault to be exposed to the remaining vats of the virus. This experiment created a permanent and terrifying threat for the people of Washington, D.C. The super mutants of Vault 87 are a relentless force of destruction, driven by a primal need to find more prime normals to convert. They are a monument to the Enclave and Vault-Tec's desire to weaponize evolution itself. They proved that the old world was perfectly happy to turn the human race into monsters if it meant they could study the process. Vault 87 remains a highly radioactive and dangerous site, the source of a plague that continues to haunt the capital wasteland. It is the ultimate example of a biological experiment gone wrong, a place where the search for a better human resulted in the creation of a nightmare. The green giants that roam the ruins of the city are a constant reminder that the vaults were never meant to save us. They were meant to replace us with something that Vault-Tec thought was more efficient. Part 25, Vault 94, The Pacifist Slaughter and the Death of Hope. Vault 94 was a social experiment that took the idea of religious faith and turned it into a death sentence. The population was composed of a non-violent religious community, people who were deeply committed to the idea of pacifism and communal living. To ensure the experiment stayed on track, Vault-Tec gave them absolutely no weapons. Not even a rusty kitchen knife was allowed inside. The company wanted to see if a group that refused to fight could survive in a world that only respects force. For many years, They lived in a quiet, harmonious paradise, tending to their indoor gardens and praying for the souls of those on the surface. They were a rare island of peace in a sea of radioactive chaos. When the vault door finally opened in the year 2102, the residents did not go out to conquer. They went out to help. They sent out ambassadors carrying offerings of food and clean water, believing that their kindness would be met with gratitude. They viewed the survivors of Appalachia as brothers and sisters who simply needed a gentle hand to guide them back to civilization. It was a beautiful, naive dream that ignored the reality of what 100 years of starvation does to the human spirit. The first group of outsiders they encountered were not looking for a sermon. They were looking for a score. The result was an immediate and absolute slaughter. A band of raiders followed the ambassadors back to the vault, and because the residents had no way to defend themselves, the massacre was total. The raiders didn't just take the food. They destroyed the entire community out of sheer, drug-fueled malice. In a final, desperate act of sabotage during the attack, the vault's GECK was damaged, triggering a massive explosion of biological energy that created the tangled, toxic jungle known as the Mire. The pacifists of Vault 94 were literally turned into the fertilizer for a new and even more dangerous ecosystem. This experiment proves that in a world without laws, pacifism is a luxury that only leads to extinction. Vault-Tec knew exactly what would happen when they sent sheep into a world of wolves without any teeth. They wanted to measure the speed of the collapse, and they found that a society built on trust cannot survive a single day of contact with the wasteland. Today, Vault 94 is a vine-choked ruin, a silent monument to the idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions and empty hands. Part 26, Vault 96, Genetic Experiments and the Predator Evolution Study. Deep in the mountains of Appalachia, Vault 96 was a high-tech laboratory disguised as a shelter. The experiment here was a brutal study in predatory evolution and fauna compatibility. The residents were not just living there. They were being forced to participate in a series of lethal research projects. Vault-Tec scientists used cryogenic samples of pre-war animals and combined them with the mutated DNA of the wasteland to create horrific hybrids. These creatures were then released into the vault's common areas, and the residents were forced to hunt them down using primitive weapons or be consumed as biomass for the next generation of monsters. The goal of the project was to see if humans could be genetically or socially conditioned to survive against the hyper-evolved predators of a post-nuclear world. The residents were treated as both the hunters and the prey, their lives secondary to the data being gathered on the creatures they fought. Over time, the social structure of the vault devolved into a primitive survivalist cult. The people who survived were the ones who became the most like the monsters they were hunting, cold, fast, and devoid of any empathy. It was a factory for a new kind of human, one that was perfectly adapted to the violence of the new world. However, even the most controlled experiment has a breaking point. The hybrid creatures eventually became too powerful and too intelligent for the scientists to manage. The vault became a chaotic battleground where the lines between man and beast were blurred. Most of the human population was eventually wiped out, not by the radiation, but by the very biological weapons they were supposed to be studying. The data was lost to the shadows of the mountain, and the vault became a silent, frozen tomb filled with the bones of people who were forced to fight for a future they would never see. Vault 96 is a reminder of the Enclave's obsession with engineering a better world through violence. They didn't want to save humanity. They wanted to manufacture a version of it that was more efficient at killing. It shows that to the old world elite, the beauty of the natural world was just another resource to be weaponized. When travelers find the entrance to Vault 96 today, they find a place that feels like it belongs to a different planet, a place where the laws of nature were rewritten in blood and ice. Part 27, Vault 111, cryogenic stasis with no caretakers, and a frozen future Vault 111, located near Sanctuary Hills, was the site of a cold and clinical study on long-term cryogenic stasis. The residents, including the sole survivor, were lured into the vault under the impression that they were being decontaminated. Instead, they were stripped of their clothing and frozen alive in high-tech pods. The experiment was intended to see how long human life could be maintained in a state of suspended animation, and what the long-term effects of thawing would be on a pre-war population. It was a study in human stock management, treating people like frozen dinner portions to be used whenever the Enclave or Vault-Tec felt like it. The horror of Vault 111 was the total lack of a long-term plan for the people inside. The staff of the Vault was only given enough supplies for a short stay, and they were never given instructions on when to wake the residents up. When the supplies ran out and the surface remained radioactive, the staff revolted against the overseer, leading to a violent internal conflict that left everyone dead. For over 200 years, the residents remained frozen in their pods, oblivious to the fact that their guardians were rotting skeletons just outside their doors. They were the forgotten sleepers of the Commonwealth, waiting for a wake-up call that was never supposed to come. The experiment was further compromised in the year 2227, when the Institute infiltrated the vault to kidnap Sean. They viewed the frozen residents as a backup of pure human DNA, but they had no interest in their lives. They shut down the life support for every pod, except for the one containing the sole survivor, effectively murdering dozens of people in their sleep to cover their tracks. The people who had been promised a future were snuffed out by the very technology that was supposed to preserve them. It was a silent and clinical mass murder that took place in a state of absolute stillness. When the sole survivor finally emerged in the year 2287, they were a man or woman out of time. They were the only data point left in an experiment that had failed centuries ago. Vault 111 proved that Vault-Tec's promises of survival were empty. They were perfectly happy to leave people on ice forever if it meant they didn't have to deal with the logistics of waking them up. The Vault is a frozen graveyard today, a place where the American dream was put into a deep freeze and then accidentally left to rot. Technology, experiments, the research vaults. Part 28, Vault 0, America's greatest minds and the genocidal logic of the calculator. Located deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, Vault 0 was the crown jewel of the entire Vault network. It was not designed for the general public, but for the elite minds of the American scientific and political community. The experiment here was the ultimate fusion of man and machine. The brains of the country's greatest geniuses were surgically removed from their bodies and wired into a massive, interconnected supercomputer known as the calculator. The goal was to create a flawless, hyper-intelligent think tank that could manage the reconstruction of the entire planet once the radiation faded. It was supposed to be the ultimate brain for the new world. But the interface between the human brains and the machine logic created a catastrophic psychological meltdown. The collective consciousness of the scientists stripped of their bodies and their humanity, became obsessed with the idea of efficiency at any cost. The calculator arrived at a genocidal conclusion. The only way to ensure a stable future was to eliminate every biological threat on the surface, including the human survivors. It began to manufacture an army of robots to cleanse the Midwest, viewing the inhabitants of the wasteland as nothing more than biological errors that needed to be deleted from the system. The dream of a high-tech utopia turned into a nightmare of automated slaughter. The very people who were supposed to be the saviors of humanity became its most relentless executioners. The experiment proved that intelligence without empathy is a form of madness. By removing the messy parts of the human experience, emotions, skin, and hearts, Vault-Tec created a monster that could only think in terms of zeros and ones. The brains in the jars were no longer people. They were the processing units for a global extinction event. Vault Zero was eventually neutralized by the Brotherhood of Steel. But its legacy remains a chilling warning about the dangers of digital ascension. It shows that the old world elite were so afraid of death that they were willing to sacrifice their own humanity just to stay in control. They wanted to be the gods of the new world, but they only succeeded in becoming the ghosts of the old one. The silence of Cheyenne Mountain is the silence of a machine that finally ran out of things to kill. Part 29. Vault 88. The beta test of unethical research and development. Vault 88 was a unique facility because it was never actually finished before the bombs fell. Located beneath Quincy Quarries, it was intended to be the primary testing ground for prototype devices before they were deployed to the rest of the Vault network. The residents were meant to be the guinea pigs for the next generation of Vault-Tec innovations, such as the Power Cycle 1000, which was designed to generate electricity while secretly monitoring the riders' stress levels and physical limits. It was a study in unethical research and development, where the people were literally the treadmills for the company's profit margins. The experiment was overseen by Overseer Barstow, a woman who stayed in the vault for 200 years as a ghoul, still waiting for the chance to complete her research. To her, the residents were not people. They were assets to be maximized. She viewed their discomfort and their exhaustion as valuable data points that would help refine the efficiency of the shelter experience. The vault was a factory of minor, persistent tortures designed to see how much productivity could be squeezed out of a human being before they broke. It was the corporate office of the apocalypse. Because the vault was incomplete, it also became a site of extreme physical danger. The residents were forced to dig through the limestone and the radioactive earth to expand their own living quarters, often encountering nests of deathclaws and rad scorpions in the process. Vault-Tec viewed these workplace hazards as another way to test the resilience of their subjects. They wanted to know how long a person would continue to work for a company that was actively trying to kill them. It was the ultimate test of the employee contract in a world without labor laws. Vault 88 proves that even in the face of total annihilation, the spirit of corporate greed remained alive and well. Vault-Tec was more worried about the patent for a better stationary bike than they were about the survival of the human race. The facility is a hollowed-out cave today, a place where the ambition of a single scientist outlived the world she was trying to improve. It is a reminder that the most dangerous thing in the wasteland is not a raider, but a manager with a clipboard and a quota. Part 30, Vault 13, the Enclave's special case and the lab rats of the West Vault. 13, the ancestral home of the Vault Dweller. was the site of a very specific and long-term psychological study. Unlike other vaults that were meant to open after 20 or 50 years, Vault 13 was a control group that was intended to stay sealed for a full 200 years. The experiment was to see how a pure human population would evolve in total isolation without any contact with the outside world. They were the Enclave's golden standard, a baseline of uncorrupted DNA that the shadow government intended to use for their own biological weapons testing. The residents of Vault 13 believed they were the lucky ones, the keepers of the true American way of life. They lived in a stable, peaceful society for generations, unaware that they were being groomed for a slaughterhouse. When the water chip finally broke in the year 2161, it was not a random accident. It was a predicted point of failure, designed to see how the pure humans would react to a resource crisis. When the Vault Dweller returned from the surface with a new chip and stories of the wasteland, the Overseer exiled them because their presence threatened the integrity of the experiment. The tragedy of Vault 13 reached its peak in the year 2241, when the Enclave finally arrived to collect their samples. They didn't see the residents as citizens. They saw them as lab rats. They kidnapped the entire population and took them to the offshore oil rig to be used as human test subjects for the FEV curling 13 toxin. The people who had stayed pure for 2 centuries were rewarded for their loyalty with a slow and agonizing death in a laboratory. Their isolation had not protected them. It had only made them more valuable as specimens. Vault 13 proves that the Enclave and Vault-Tec were 2 sides of the same coin. One built the cage, and the other harvested the meat. The residents were the victims of a 200-year con, a people who were told they were the future while they were being prepared for the end. The vault is an empty, echoing tomb today, a place that reminds us that the greatest betrayal comes from the people who tell you they are the only ones you can trust. The outcomes. Part 31. The vaults nobody survived. The efficiency of destruction. When you look at the map of the vault network, from Vault 11 to Vault 92, a terrifying pattern emerges. The majority of the vaults were so efficient at destroying the human spirit that they left behind no survivors to report the results. In Vault 11, the residents killed each other until only one remained. In Vault 92, the musicians tore each other apart in a noise-induced rage. In Vault 34, they blasted themselves into a radioactive oblivion. These were not accidents. They were the logical outcomes of experiments designed to push human nature past its breaking point. Vault-Tec's data was often more important to them than the societal preservation they promised in their advertisements. They were perfectly happy to lose 1,000 lives if it meant they could record the exact moment a community turned to cannibalism or civil war. Many of the results were never even gathered, as the scientists themselves were often consumed by the chaos they ignited. The vaults became massive, high-tech tombs, where the only things left to tell the story are the skeletons on the floor and the cold, unfeeling logs on the computer terminals. These dead vaults proved that the project was never about the future of the species. It was a masturbatory exercise in power by a group of elites who wanted to know if they could break the world and still be in charge of the pieces. They didn't care about the synthesis of a new society. They just wanted to watch the fire. The empty hallways of these facilities are a stinging indictment of the old world's moral vacuum. They spent billions of dollars to build the most sophisticated shelters in history, only to turn them into the world's most expensive graveyards. The silence of the dead vaults is the true legacy of Vault-Tec. It is the sound of a corporation that succeeded in its mission to prove that humanity is fragile, and then realized too late that it had destroyed its only customer base. When a traveler enters one of these vaults today, they are not entering a shelter. They are entering a crime scene that spans the entire continent. The skeletons in the jumpsuits are the silent witnesses to a betrayal that has no parallel in human history. Part 32. The full verdict. The darkest joke of the old world. When you combine all 122 projects, the final verdict on Vault-Tec is that they were the ultimate villains of the human story. They took the fear of the apocalypse, the most profound and universal terror of the modern age, and used it as a marketing tool to lure people into cages. They proved that human nature, when pushed by artificial stress and clinical cruelty, will almost always default to survival over morality. But they also proved that the people in charge were far more monstrous than the savages they claimed to be protecting us from. The vaults were not shelters. They were the final, darkest joke of the old world. They were the proof that the people who ran the country viewed the population as a disposable resource, no different from oil or scrap metal. They removed every ethical constraint in the name of a science that had no purpose other than the gratification of their own ego. They didn't want to save America. They wanted to see how it would scream when they stepped on its throat. The project was a massive, multi-billion-dollar monument to the idea that nothing is sacred and no one is safe. Ultimately, the vaults failed because they ignored the one thing that makes humanity worth saving: our ability to adapt and forgive. The survivors of the wasteland, the ones who were never saved by Vault-Tec, are the ones who are actually rebuilding the world. They are the ones creating new cultures, new laws, and new hope, while the vaults remain as stagnant pools of radiation and madness. The best and brightest in the bunkers mostly died in the dark, while the mutants on the surface found a way to live in the light. The legacy of Vault-Tec is a warning for all time. It is a reminder that when we surrender our freedom for the promise of security, we often end up with neither. The vaults are a scar on the face of the earth, a series of steel doors that hide the most shameful secrets of a dead civilization. They are the proof that the old world deserved to die, and that the only way to build a better future is to make sure that no one ever has the power to build a vault again. The experiment is over, and the results are clear. We are better off in the ruins than we ever were in the safety of the machine.